Okay, everyone, hello. Oh, hello. Audience participation from the start, that's very good. I mean, funny thing is, sort of after being called a lecturer for so many years, one of the things you very often little do, really, is actually lecture. So it's kind of a weird thing to sort of do this kind of stuff, really. Anyway, I'm Graham Griffiths. I work at the Institute of Education. Is everybody, can you hear me at the back? Is that all right? Is everyone okay? Right, excellent. Yeah, and I was a maths teacher at City and Islington College for many a year before getting involved in teacher training. So that was sort of my background. I had taught A-level and Gcse and adult work, so a fair sort of range of various things. Now I deal with teacher training for adult numeracy, and that I think is likely to move much more into this kind of arena. Anyway, today I wanted to have a look at the changes that are going to happen, because obviously that's the reason why I was invited along. To think a little bit about what the impact on institutions are, so you can have a think about some of those things for yourself, the institution and you as individuals, that is. I wanted to represent some various views about mathematics and mathematics education along the way. To think a little bit about context, because obviously embedding is one of the things that's sort of happening and an in kind of thing at the moment, but not the only thing, which is the issue, and to think about what next. So that's the plan. One of the big central drivers to this, so outside of the embedding sort of issue, if you like, was the Gcse notion. So, I mean, it's kind of interesting that, you know, basically a lot of people fail, a lot of the students fail to get their Gcse grade C or above and go on, and quite a lot of those don't carry on. They don't pass, they don't carry on, and that's quite a significant issue, because it means with what's been happening at the moment is currently in lots of 16 to 18 institutions, many of them are not carrying on to do this. And then now they're expected to so that's going to have quite a big impact. So we're kind of conscious, are we not, that, I'm sure you are, that now the idea is that the intention is that all students will eventually be in this age range, be studying mathematics. If they haven't already got a grade A to C, then they're going to be doing Gcse or some route to it. So at the moment they're talking about functional skills or freestanding maths qualifications, if you've heard of those. And obviously, and then the other thing, which is not quite as heavily talked about yet, but is the notion of having an alternative. So if you do have a grade C, what then, if you're supposed to then do some maths, what are you going to do? So the idea is, and you don't want to do A-level, that is, if you're not going to go on the A-level route, then there's a thing called core mathematics, which is being developed at the moment and coming along. I'm going to leave the PowerPoint here. There's a link to the policy statement around some of these things. It's probably not worth bringing it up now. So overall, what that's going to mean, of course, is that, you know, implication-wise, it's going to increase the amount of hours of mathematics teaching that's going on in 16 to 18 education. So it's kind of estimated across the country that we're going to need something like 2,000 extra teachers. And of course, there's this notion that what we're going to do is bring in some learners to do some mathematics that currently are choosing not to do so, and that has some kind of impact. So I'm wondering, before I carry on, I was just wondering some thoughts from yourselves about this. I mean, what were your thoughts? Talk to your sort of neighbour, as it were. Have you thought about these issues, and what do you think about what's being planned? You may, obviously, sorry. I'm breaking. Okay. Okay, shall I break in again there for a second? So, not sure what you feel is politic to say or what you can say in such a large audience, but off you go.
Will you get extra funding for these teachers?
Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it?
Where's
I mean,
the funding come from? It's my go, it's cutting funding, and you want to go on strike about it.
okay. So some of these things we'll pick up. I think we should pick up a little bit more of this, but I think it's a good question about where the funding is coming from. And I mean, in essence, the envelope of funding has not changed, and that's one of the issues. They're suggesting that you reframe the way things that currently are happening. So it's an increase in the maths hours, if you like, it has to be bought at something's expense. Is the notion, which is an interesting one. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
Well, does that mean like you've got 5 hours of chemistry, 4 hours of chemistry, 1 hour of maths in that chemistry course?
Well, I mean, obviously institutions have got to make their choices about how they do things. I can't tell you how you're going to do it, but the funding envelope exists, that's there, and it is expecting certain things. So I guess something has to be bought off somewhere. It's not. I mean, I'm not here as a. I should have said that really. I'm not a representative, obviously, of the government in relation to this thing. So I'm telling you about some of the policy things that are happening, and I'm going to tell you about my take on some of this. But that is one of the issues, clearly.
So just to clarify, it's like a standalone course then. So if they've already got GCSE maths, they have to do some other standalone course, whether it be A-level or maths. You couldn't embed it, for example. You couldn't.
Well, now there's an interesting question. Yeah. Again, I mean, I think you would have to justify how you're doing it, but I suppose.
These skills,
Well, maybe we'll come back to a bit about what's in these things, because I think that's a very interesting question again about what's the content. Because the alternative, things like the freestanding maths qualifications or functional skills aren't like key skills, if you like. They are different.
Just think that I'd actually agree with doing more maths. But the system in this country ain't set up for it. To specialise in your 16th grade and you do 3 to 4 subjects. The baccalaureate system you do maths and English till you're 18 with 7 other subjects done less intensively.
Yeah.
So getting to do more maths I'd agree with, but you have to change the whole thing. You're doing 3 subjects, the focus is narrow. The focus is too narrow anyway, but that's the way the system is set up.
Right.
Saying you need more maths.
Yeah. So
And
perhaps.
then, but you don't have the system set up for it. Like, you either have everything taught less intensively with English and maths,
Okay.
or you.
So you're suggesting essentially that the change is not. I mean, just changing one bit of it is not really the way to do this. Yeah. It's a good point.
One of the challenges we're going to have with BSix is so many of our learners don't actually achieve grade C.
Yeah.
And there's been a kind of almost a perception that it's optional.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges is it's not optional because of
Yeah.
the funding issue and to get the students to grade C.
Exactly.
That's going to be one of our big challenges.
It is indeed, as it is, and it isn't just B6. I mean, be aware of that. This is a problem. I mean, we know that it's sort of something like there's the ones that continue. It's only about half the people pass with the grade C anyway. So clearly, it's not kind of working now. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the future.
Is this format thing accredited?
Yes, well, that is the intention. It doesn't quite exist yet. I mean, the specifications have been proposed. I think actually they're written now. I think now they're into the stage of awarding bodies are now writing awards to go with them. And they're going to be piloted the idea is for next academic year.
So what does it really work in theory?
The size of it sort of thing.
Well, what's its real value in terms of qualification value? I mean, how does it fit into this?
Yeah.
It's not an AS Maths. They've done their GCSE. Well,
Yeah.
what is it?
So that's going to be one of the issues, yes. I mean, at the moment, there is the thing called the AS Use of Mathematics, which incorporates some of the freestanding maths qualification units and pulls together, and it's sort of worth half an A level, I think it is. And they were thinking of something along those lines is where they're going with it. I must admit, I've got to look at the detail of that to be absolutely sure of it. But I mean, that will be the questions. Those are the things that will be raised about it. Yeah.
Is there any research about that?
So we'll come on to touching some of those questions, but I think that's a really interesting question about does embedding work, kind of thing. I mean, there is some notion that there is evidence on that one, yes.
So you're saying basically that we're required to do more hours of maths, but
Yeah.
there isn't funding to accommodate that, is that correct?
It's considered to be part of the envelope that already exists, if you like, the funding.
So you're not going to give any extra money for it. Do you know any solutions that other colleges have come up with to deal with this issue?
No, but I think that's what one is going to have to look at, and obviously that's what the management team are going to be looking at. I mean, these are one of the things that you need to consider. I want to step back a bit, and we can come on to some more of that stuff at the end. I suppose I was expecting there to be some concerns about it. That was the point. I wanted to sort of raise that. Although it's kind of nice to... Well, I suppose I ought to admit, being a maths background, I have a passion for mathematics. I suppose everybody has a passion for their subject, so it's not very surprising. Probably everybody thinks their subject's the most important thing in the world. With mathematics, it's sort of been kind of shoved in there as the thing that's most important, and we know some of the reasons why. Let me just show you a quote here. Let's have a look at this and think about, when do you think this was said? It's been said, for instance, that the accuracy and the manipulation of figures does not reach the same standard which was reached 20 years ago. Some employers express surprising concern at the inability of young persons to perform simple numerical operations involved in business. Okay, any thoughts about when that might have been said?
1950.
Okay, it's before. So what did you say? 1822. Why did you say 1822? It's not, but I'm just interested why you... Just a guess, just a wild guess.
I think I saw some letters.
Oh, okay. You think you've seen something from before? Okay. Yeah. Well, actually, it was the 19th century, though. This was a report in 1876. It's a HMI report in 1876. So, in some ways, none of what we're seeing now looks very different. It's quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, it was reported in the same thing. One of the key reports that changed quite a lot of things back in the 80s was the Cockroft Report, and that summarised a number of these points. The Cockroft Report, the sort of what's the word? The initiative that was set up that created the Cockroft Report was from a 1977 government report, which again talked about this problem of computational skills, and also this thing about lack of communication. So there was also been concerns about that back then. These things keep reoccurring. In 2004, we had the Smith report, again showing some of the similar things. Here, worried about lack of specialist maths teachers, which was also in the one before. And whether or not it meets the requirements of employers and higher education. So, in some ways, we've seen a lot of this kind of thing already. But what I would like to say a little bit more from the Smith report was that they did raise some issues here that were maybe not raised in some of the earlier things. So that actually here, there was the issue of teaching and learning. They were thinking the teaching and learning experience was a bit of an issue. And I think that was important. But also perhaps not I mean, that might sound like teacher bashing. But also there is the thing is around career options and CPD they raised. So there are some sort of positive messages around for teachers too, in some of the things that they said. Where am I up to? So, if any people remember, if anybody remembers the Cockroft Report, when you're around, it was about the time that I was studying myself, so I didn't really remember it, but it was quite important for when I was doing a lot of my teacher training and things. But it's the thing that effectively introduced GCSE, and also, perhaps interestingly, and for some of the things that are going on now, is the notion of using and applying mathematics. So they set that up as a strand that has sort of never quite gone away, and that comes into this sort of functional skills kind of notion, or embedding, as some of you have been talking It's probably worth noting that it was the Smith report that changed the tiering system, so it went from 3 tiers down to 2. They also recommended a dual award. So one of the other things that's been knocking around for quite a few years is the notion of having 2 GCSEs in the same way as there's 2 English GCSEs. So that there'd be a kind of, if you like, a more practical one and a more theoretical one was the notion. And that actually has had some pilots that have just finished. Now, whether or not that goes ahead is all in the air because of some of these other things that happen. So there's a lot of initiative things going on that can cause some problems. But anyway, so the dual award notion is still sort of hanging there a bit and a bit uncertain about where that's going through. Obviously, we've also had some other, I'm sure you're aware of the big debates around calculator use and mathematics. So we've got calculator and non-calculator papers for various in GCSE and decisions about whether or not you're going to allow them in other things. And the other big thing of the removal of coursework, which happened earlier for GCSE maths than the other subjects. Okay, so that was some of the actions that have already happened. Just as a reminder, because you're probably aware of some of these things you've mentioned, key and functional skills, but you know that notion of having a kind of vocational stream, which it was sort of intended for. Went way back, so there was the first versions of core and key skills, in which embedding was exactly what it was. It really was about finding out what was going on in that subject area. When I first started teaching, I did a business HND. I used to teach on one of those. I'd teach the maths on it. We would be looking to teach mathematics that they use within the business area already. So we didn't bring in other things. It was just those bits that were required. That was the idea, and you put assessment in for those and assess for it. So we used to do things like moving averages, because that made sense with the things that they were doing. But in Curriculum 2000, it was changed to a new version of key skills where we had the national tests and then the portfolio things. So these multiple choice national tests were introduced. Functional skills has been the thing that came along and replaced that. Where perhaps the word is more contextualised than embedded, because that's really the issue now. I think there was a sort of sense in which the original national tests for the Curriculum 2000 key skills, the idea, what they had intended to do, but turned out to be a bit impractical, was to kind of have questions, equivalent questions, in all of the setting, or in the main settings of the various subject areas. So you'd have your catering maths questions, and your hairdressing maths questions, and that was the idea. They wanted to set up banks of questions that they could pull down, they'd have equivalent questions, and they could use those. So they really, truly could embed everything that was going on. And that never happened. I mean, in the end, every student does the same test, or a same sort of test, which was drawn from sort of randomly, effectively, from a big bank, and they would obviously have questions that weren't in their context. So in the end, I think with the functional skills, the notion is now to try to have questions that people would have some sort of relationship with, but they're probably more everyday than they are vocational. So that's an interesting sort of development. The other thing that's happened, does anybody know about the freestanding maths qualifications? I've mentioned them a couple of times. Does anybody know? Any other maths people? Right, used to it. Okay. So some people, but I mean, they may have, it's quite easy to have missed them, partly because they were funded. They are funded. They still exist, but a bit like, and your question about the currency of what core maths is sort of comes back to these kind of things. These things can exist, but they may not get taken up if nobody really wants them, and there can be real problems. So a lot of places did pick up on the freestanding maths qualifications and go with them. They were intended, they existed at level 1, 2 and 3. They were smaller units, but some of them could be grouped together. As I said, the level 3 ones, they could be grouped together to make an AS level. And they were intended to be contextualised, and the question is the extent to which actually some of the functional skills papers use FSMQs as their model, but also the extent to which the core maths thing might also be using that. So if you want to know what core maths looks a bit like, actually, you can have a look at some of the freestanding maths quals because that seems to be the way things are going with it. Okay. So what we seem to have is, on the one hand, a kind of more rigorous Gcse, as we know, that seems to be being brought in. And that's the term they're using. They're talking about A-level as well. But then this other notion of an applied kind of core kind of maths afterwards for higher level, and obviously it's a bit unclear actually what the future is for functional skills. Nobody's talking about it necessarily, although they are definitely funding it. I mean, that's worthwhile saying. So I mean, it's not that it's being pulled, but it doesn't necessarily fit into this message of the other things that are going on at the moment. Because Gcse is the focus for this government for up to level 2. And then they want this core maths thing for the beyond level 2 kind of notion. But I think it's kind of interesting, this notion of the more rigorous and then the sort of applied notion, and how do they sit together? So you've got to do your applied kind of notions after having a core in that kind of thinking. So I want to now think a little bit about context. Because I think this is important. Obviously, you've raised the issue of context and embedding and those kind of things. I want to ask you, okay, here's a question. It's the sort of thing, actually, that often students in schools do a bit of maths for a Friday afternoon. But rather than actually doing it, can you think of a question that would require you to do a 6 times 3? So have a think about that. So some students, when they've been asked to do this in schools, have written down, what is the answer to the question 6 times 3? We're not looking for that. Anybody want to give me a potential answer?
6 theories, 3 concepts.
6 theories.
3 concepts in each.
3 concepts in each theory. How many concepts are there altogether? Okay, all right, that's an interesting one. What did you have? Somebody up there?
Sorry?
Did somebody have one up here?
Yes, we all go to the club and have 3 pints each.
Okay. How many pints in total? Right, okay. Oh, there's an interesting one for me, actually.
There were 6 people, they wanted 3 slices of cake each. How many slices of cake do they all have?
Yes. How do you need or something if you're the caterer?
Find the area of the rectangle.
Find the area of a rectangle. Now, there's interesting. Okay. Any others? Because here's an... If you replace 5.4 and 2.5 instead of 6 times 3, does your scenario still work? Yes. It's interesting, isn't it? So, I mean, you could probably change... I mean, your thing with the pints, of course, you could change one of those to being decimal, but the other one has to stay probably fixed. Or maybe half pints, if you like. You could get away with something, maybe. Oh! Okay, that's an interesting point, yes. But it's an interesting issue there of what would happen, if area's an interesting model. So the thing is, the mathematics that we have, there's a link between what we do and the context. So if you want a model for multiplication that does more than doing whole numbers, you need to be able to think of something that does that kind of thing with it. So the area is one example, and in fact that's the whole point. It kind of works for lots of things. So if you want to do multiplication of fractions or decimals, that's the model that would work. Well, some of these other things won't. So you need to have something to hang things on. It was something that there's a notion, an idea that came from the Netherlands of realistic mathematics education. I've been told that probably the word realistic isn't quite the right word, because that sounds like it really means every day or something. Realisable was what somebody else would suggest. They think that all mathematics, you should be able to have a model for it. in order to be able to understand it. Something realisable, meaning there's something in front that you can deal with. So really, if you want to teach some multiplication and make sure that people can do some of these other things, you probably do need to think of area. Hello.
Sorry, I've got a question thinking about the context. I mean, looking at how you might apply mathematical models to teaching experience, all students doing the same activity, in theory, no problem. They
Yeah.
all work out, work on the same sums, and see how that fits into the context. If the context is to allow them to explore something more individually,
Yeah.
then they might all need to apply mathematics in a different way. For example, if they're exploring architecture, they may not all need to focus on the scaling, but might need to look at more of the shapes. And so
Well, this was always
that's
one.
a puzzle.
This was always the problem between that change between the Key Skills version 1 to Key Skills version 2, because version 2 wanted a nationally sort of comparable system. That was the point. So in order to do that, you start losing the specificness of particular areas of the curriculum. So clearly, you know, some bits of maths are going to be used more in certain areas than in another. I mean, that's obviously the case. So if you're then to want to give the same thing to everybody, you do have that problem. You've raised it, and I think that is a tension that we have. But I think that's also a tension why it's moved a little bit away from embedding more to contextualization. Because the idea is that maybe you can think of things that do work, that a lot of people can understand, but isn't necessarily in the context of the vocational area, if you like. But a sort of more understandable one. But, I mean, there are some wacky, or potentially wacky contexts. I mean, in a recent AQ, or I shouldn't say that, a recent paper, Functional Skills, they had a question about chicken coops. And it just amused us a little bit, with Sarah with her 2 silkies and 7 leghorns, and asking questions about, you know, what should she buy, because it seemed a rather strange context. That I suppose you might say it's an equal opportunities context because there probably aren't too many people who are terribly interested in it. But it's really you can get it very wrong. That's the point. I mean, you know, the trouble is, how do you get it right? What is the context that appeals to everybody? And that's a much harder question. So, and I mean, I think, you know, in the past we've had people like Professor John Barrow who gets very excited. He's written many things. He goes around and does talks about maths is everywhere. And you probably have people like that, very excitable. People like me, maths, we're really excited. Mathematics, you can see it all over the clusterings of the galaxies and the interactions between particles. It's what we do to send people off into space. But we can also see it in art and in music as well. But the question is, you know, is that really a bit of an oversell? And does it really, really help to keep doing that? I must admit I question that kind of approach. Just to say, by the way, in terms of, there are some initiatives that are happening at the moment. You may or may not have heard of some of these. So that bursaries are back in, but only potentially last year and this year. So this is bursaries for people to study, to train to teach maths. Get 20,000 quid if you've got the right degree classification. There are even golden hellos that are being proposed now. So from April of this year, now, people who start to become a maths teacher can sort of claim a maths golden hello. Is that one of the things that's not for sixth form colleges, though? I can't remember now, actually. I can't remember that one works, does it? Okay. I know that the recruitment incentive was specifically not for sixth form colleges. That BIS were giving some money to colleges to actually recruit graduates with high degree classifications to come and teach maths. That's just happened. There's the Gcse Mathematics Enhancement Programme. There's an English one too, but there's an enhancement programme that's intended to support teachers in teaching GCSE mathematics. Well, actually, it's to support them to upskill their own knowledge, So it's really trying to get people who've maybe been teaching adult numeracy and functional skills a lot to be prepared to teach Gcse a bit more. So that was the idea. That was to try and get at some of this 2,000 that was mentioned earlier. I was actually involved in part of the writing of that, actually. That was the reason why I know about it. They are intending to have subject knowledge courses that would be acting as conversion courses. So somebody who might teach some science subjects, for example, might then move into teaching mathematics is the idea. In the same way as they've got similar kind of programs for schools. Subject knowledge enhancement programs, they call them, and they want to do an equivalent for post-compulsory, and they're even thinking of an equivalent of a Teach First. So these are kind of initiatives that are happening at the moment. So they are putting some money into it, although not some of the money where you might want it, to do this kind of work. Okay. So we've got these changes. I think there are massive staffing implications. I think really the issue is there's quite a lot of professional development implications for some individuals, because where the money is going is there. There are some dangers to all this, because I think the fact is, you know, the history has shown us that people are failing to do maths, and so insisting everybody does it is likely to end up with even more failure. So there's quite a lot of real dangers ahead of us, but also some opportunities. So I think, you know, obviously from my angle, there's quite a way open to sort of develop a bit more. I would like to see people really thinking much more about context and mathematics and teaching, and to do what the Smith report said, which is really to try and come up with some engaging teaching and learning activities. There are ideas out there that can help with that. But I do recognise that there's some potential problems as well. So that's what I wanted to say, about the right time. Now we can go back to some of those questions, I think.
Are you being slightly cynical about some of these initiatives, or are you talking based on experience?
It's probably a bit of both.
Or is it based on research, for example, national research carried out in schools or colleges?
Well, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that the fact is we've had the recognition of this kind of problem has been around for a very long time, and there have been many initiatives to try and deal with some of these problems. We don't yet appear to have solved the problems. So maybe that's what I'm trying to suggest is really where we're at. That doesn't mean you shouldn't keep trying, and that doesn't mean that each go there isn't potential to actually move things on. I think each of those stages has moved things on. I think we're in a much better place now than where we were 150 years ago. I would say that. So, but it doesn't mean it's easy. Anything else? Other questions?
Just a comment. I think one of the problems is it's cultural. It's about creating a change in culture about the importance of numeracy and maths. And I think we can get people to believe that.
Yeah.
It seems to me that we've been on this downward spiral of, well, maths, you know, doesn't really matter. And it feels like that.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to change.
I know, and I think it's difficult, isn't it? And that's why people like Professor Barrow would go around doing their let's big up mathematics kind of stuff. Yeah. So sorry. Yeah, it was a bit. There are cultural issues around here. One of the things we're trying to deal with is the fact that people can be quite negative about mathematics, and you're never going to solve it if we're in a negative spiral down. So perhaps my cynicism doesn't help very much if you're in that downward spiral. And so, you know, one can see the kind of sense of why, John Barrow and various other people, I mean, I'm just quoted him, so I just put it there, but other people are promoting. They want to big up mathematics. And I think it is important I think we do need to create that, actually. I think that's right. I actually think, because I am so positive about mathematics, I want to make my students very positive about mathematics too. But I don't want to do it for the wrong reasons. I don't want to sell them something. I don't want to sell them a pup. And I think the trouble is we often say things are really exciting and then they end up doing something completely not. And that's what worries me.
I'm a chemistry teacher, and the students can't add positive numbers and negative numbers together when we do redox.
Right.
So there is an issue, basic mathematical understanding.
Yeah.
Which finish their T learning, and they've got GCSE A or B, or some of them got C. They can't add +5 plus -2.
Well,
So,
okay. So there's an issue going on there, isn't there?
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not sure it's necessarily the basics, because as you just said, they probably actually do know it within a certain set of scenarios.
They use their calculators.
They use their calculators. Well, maybe, but I mean, there's clearly something going on about the whole thing that they're not getting that probably needs to be approached that in a kind of different way. But I know that nothing is easy about this. This is the point, and you probably need to come at it from a different angle. Sorry, there's a hand up here. I want to just thank.
I was just thinking about the negativity around maths.
Yeah.
Like that, and the student negativity around maths, the students that struggle with it. And I'm thinking that maths is quite specific in that, well, mine, what I know and how I was taught it, is either right or you're wrong. And
Right.
so much, I think it's very hard for kids to be told they're wrong, and it's like failing, and then that, then we fail in getting maths. There's no sort of room for sort of confidence building, so you're constantly telling someone, no, that's wrong, and you fail again.
Yeah.
If there's like some kind of way to address that issue.
I mean, the assessments aren't all like that. I mean, I think it's true that the multiple choice version of key skills obviously did have everything really was clear cut, right and wrong. I mean, most marking schemes on GCSEs or now with the functional skills, and that was deliberately so, are to give methods for marks for methods. And so there is an intent to say, well, you got this right about it. I mean, of course, they're not engaging with the markers, I realise that, but you would hope that this filters down through the system with teachers, is that people are saying, yeah, okay, well, you got this right about it. I mean, obviously, there's a bit of a problem here, but there is this notion here that you got right. So one would want to emphasise that. You can, on most things, get quite more or less pass through, with all the method marks, should more or less pass you on something. So you could sort of not get any of the answers right and still potentially get it. I'm stretching it a bit there, to be honest. It's not quite true, but it nearly is true.
Adrian Smith and Malcolm Swan as well.
Yeah,
That report around 2004
yeah,
emphasised that the mistakes you made were probably the most important maths that you learn, because you learn from the misconceptions. And that's what helps you to understand the conceptual bit that goes on to you.
well,
which is a big problem.
yeah.
As Smith pointed out, for progression, you need conceptual understanding.
Yeah.
So building on mistakes is great. So making mistakes is good.
It's indeed, and I think if there are many other scenarios in which that that's where you learn. I mean, the example that's always given is the things like the video game. You go through routines until you don't succeed anymore, and then what you do is you try and get past that one, and then you move on to the next problem. And that's sort of, you could see things in there. If you saw things in those way, you would see that actually that's not a problem at all. That's part of the learning. Is actually coming up against those barriers. Hopefully not barriers, and overcoming them, I suppose, is the point. But they are a place that you're quite right with the misconceptions notion. Hello. Oh. Yeah, I mean, I think the NRDC, so the National Research and Development Centre for Literacy and Numeracy, did do some work on looking at embedding, and they tried to distinguish between different sorts of attempts to embed, and whether the staff in an area were working together with the skills development to really bring it together and develop it, or whether they were just sort of working parallel to each other, or indeed not at all. And what they found was that in those where they really worked well together, they did seem to pass more. There were better success rates over those kind of things. All of this educational research is difficult because you can never get the big enough kind of samples to sort of talk about it in a sort of huge scientific way. But certainly there was definite evidence that the embedding, it did make sense to people. So that really, and I think that's about then vocational and skills staff talking to each other really, and that's one of the important messages from that, I think. Thank you. Go on, you were...
English and
Right.
Those that are in vocational subjects that have got aren't really growing in their maths and English in the same way as those in A level who have got their standalone core, this core maths. They're developing maths and English. Those in a vocational subject are getting the English and maths which is designed to help those who haven't got their level 2.
Are you saying that that's just practically the way it's working out, rather than?
That's how it seems. I mean, we haven't actually moved to formal embedding. The idea is, I believe, next year that we're going to have maths and English staff working with us in a vocational context to have maths and English working in subject context.
Yes.
To work with those who haven't got their maths and English to make sure that they're getting up to Gcse standard. If you already have your maths and English and you're in that level 3 course, you're not getting the same opportunity as an A-level student.
To do the embedding, you mean?
To push
But that's
English skills.
but that's the but that was the purpose of the core maths.
But would a vocational student get the core maths?
Well, if there's no reason why they shouldn't. That was the point. So it is for all 16 to 18s who have already got grade C. Yeah. And it's developing in the same way, as I said, in a sense, the same way as functional skills. So it's seen as an applied kind of thing within a context.
I was thinking about the gaming thing.
Yeah.
Because my child is primary school and they have this maths week thing.
Okay.
Are there versions of that for older learners? Like, is that a successful way to learn maths? I mean, she definitely hated maths until she did that.
Yeah.
Now she really likes it.
Oh, really? Yeah. I mean, it's always interesting, isn't it?
Like algorithms in it, so that it measures whether they manage to achieve like certain areas of learning, and
Okay.
then it kind of feeds them. It's all like a bit it feeds them the things that they haven't achieved.
Okay. Right. You raised I mean, online learning and computer stuff. It's a sort of growing area, obviously. There isn't. There are assessment schemes. I don't know if you've heard of things like 4Skills and Key Skill Builder and things like that, where they do assess people with those. But some of those programs also have things that can move on afterwards. But they're not really games. I mean, that's real, like, programmed sums, really. I mean, it's intended to be a kind of course that's there. Other people are trying to work on bringing together some things that do that. So National Numeracy are trying to, when they've identified things, hook into learning opportunities for people to move on. But there's nothing as specific as what you're saying that I'm conscious of, I should say, in the post-compulsory world. And I think nobody's had the interest to do it. I think it's not to say that it's not possible. It's just that that hasn't been where people's energies have gone. Whether it should or not is another question.
Is this kind of process of embedding post-16, is that likely to be happening at Gcse and at primary as well? Because it seems that, I mean, at my primary school,
Yeah.
they do, for example, they've got about 3 or 4 ways of doing revision.
Yeah.
And they're confused when they come on, they're like, oh, we do it this way, we also do it this way, we also do it this way as well.
Yeah.
And so, and I've spoken to the teachers and say, oh, this so that lots of different ways can be involved. And
Yeah.
but to me, it seems quite confusing because, they're not sure which one to use. And that's at primary. I'm not sure what's happening at secondary as well. But is there plans to use this kind of approach in primary and secondary as well? Or is
It's a general.
what doesn't happen at GCSE or something?
There is a general notion that people ought to be conscious of different ways of doing things. I mean, certainly teachers are being developed to understand the different ways of doing things so that they don't just say, no, you're not doing that right, you've got to do it this way because this is the way I know. Whether you actually teach people different ways is an interesting question, and it's a slightly open one. I mean, you raised the notion that some kids are confused by all these things, although others would say that they've developed really well because of seeing things in these different ways. I mean, my question about the 6 times 3 thing was about having models. I mean, one of the things is you want to have many different ways of doing things possible because those models will apply in more circumstances and maybe part of a bigger development. So when you do grid ways of multiplying or something, it's because it'll help you to do some other things later as well. That's the point. So I wouldn't see it particularly negatively. Teachers are being developed, but that doesn't mean the embedding thing. Yes, well, there was. I mean, the previous, I suppose the existing version of the school national curriculum, although of course it's about to be changed. So the one that's the outgoing one does have the same process skills that were there, that started in key skills. So in key skills, which has now come through to functional skills, they talk about mathematics as having three sort of main elements of the... does anybody remember what they are? I just suddenly realised. Analysing and interpreting is the last one. What's the first one? I've lost it. It's the sort of understanding of the problem and turning it into a problem to be solved. It's gone from my mind. There are three process skills that overlaid the topics that were going on. And that was brought in. I mean, if you remember, functional skills was supposed to be for Key Stage 4 originally. That was the idea of it. So the intention was to have those kind of notions in secondary school mathematics. Having said that, we're now in a time where there seems to be a retreat from that. And that's why I mentioned this thing about the more rigorous GCSE that this government seems to be wanting to push forward. So I think there are tensions in the system around that. So I think teacher educators probably would be pushing it. The same people who are developing things like core maths would be pushing it. Maybe others aren't so much. Is it time to stop? It's gone 5 o'clock, isn't it? We should stop. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.